So here we are. We should be talking about the larger perspectives on the Cold War today. I want to introduce the topic without actually getting into the discussion of the narrative of the Cold War from the end of World War II on. Today, let's just talk about the period prior to the end of World War II, whether there were some inklings, some suggestions, some adumbrations, some foreshadowings, some prefigurations of the Cold War that go back farther, maybe to the turn of the century, maybe to World War I, maybe back into the 19th century. What there is of the prehistory of the Cold War that is worthy of our discussion. So large perspectives today on the Cold War. And the general theme is, do our old ideas about the history of world politics, and they all revolve around the notion of a balance of power, and I want to talk more about that idea, the balance of power. Do our old ideas about the history of world politics, do they make any sense into the discussion of the Cold War? Do they help us to understand the Cold War? And I want to also consider another point. Is there an ideological period? Is there an ideological conflict between socialism and capitalism? The revolutionary issues that we have to talk about in the course of this semester, do those have a prehistory as well? Do they go all the way back to the Russian Revolution? Do they go back to the Industrial Revolution? How far do they go back? So I want to discuss those things. You should have before you an outline which says Reflections on the History of World Politics Before the Cold War. So I'm going to go through the topics on that outline and give a general indication of my thoughts on this matter, not laying down the law about any of this stuff. There are many opinions about all these things, but I do have a few quirky thoughts about it that I have developed in the course of the years, dealing with this, writing about it, discussing it with students, and all those sorts of things. And in some ways, participating in some of the events that we're going to be talking about in my own little way. I'll deal with those. Let's deal with those things. The slide that you see before you gives an indication of the bipolarity of the Cold War. Frequently, they say the war is between the two superpowers, or it's a bipolar world, or the Cold War is a struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. And they like to make the argument often that the United States and the Soviet Union, they're the two biggest powers in the world after World War II. The biggest powers always quarrel. They usually fight. Why should we be surprised if the United States and the Soviet Union got into a vast struggle for the whole world after World War II? Because they had both emerged as these two massive superpowers. Very powerful argument. And we can't dismiss it very easily. This map gives an indication of how that might be viewed if you looked at it entirely in terms of the superpower confrontation. And you'd have to think about the weapons that are involved. And of course, you'd have to think about nuclear weapons. So this course is a course about the history of nuclear weapons, among other things. And that's something that often does not get the proper attention, in my opinion. But we do have to talk about nuclear weapons in the course of this discussion. And as you probably already know about the history of nuclear weapons, the United States demonstrated the bomb at the end of the war in attacking the Japanese at Hiroshima, Nagasaki. So the United States has the bomb from 1945 on. Soviets do not have a bomb. And I'm not even sure that they have a program to build nuclear weapons in 1945. But at any rate, as soon as they discovered that there were such things as nuclear weapons, they got to work right away on it. The Americans said nobody could ever develop these things, and Soviets would. Since Soviet is a very backward country, they can't even make doorknobs. They'll never be able to develop nuclear weapons. And Harry Truman, he thought that the United States would have this nuclear monopoly in indefinite future. Some people said, well, maybe it'll take them 20 years. Others said, probably 3 or 4 years. So I think the smartest observers, George Kennan, Dean Acheson, a few others, they said, well, the Soviets, now that they get to work on the bomb, now they know the thing exists, they will have a bomb within 3 or 4 years. And it was within 4 years that they did develop nuclear weapons. So from 1949 on, we have a condition of both sides a duopoly, you could call it, of nuclear weapons. And by the 1950s, they had developed intercontinental ballistics missiles, ICBMs, that could be fired from the territory of the United States, the territory of the Soviet Union, against the other side. And this map gives an indication of the path that they would follow. They would go right off the top, right over the top of the North Pole, attacking each other. Flight time about 30 minutes through most of the Cold War. I think that's pretty much close to what it is now. So in 30 minutes, they could launch enough nuclear weapons, presumably, pretty much to destroy all the major cities, or whatever major cities they wanted to destroy. Since we now have thousands of warheads, they really, they're going to get to the point where if they did have a nuclear conflict, God forbid, if they did have a nuclear conflict, in about half an hour, they could take on all the targets, and they'd be wondering what targets to hit. They would have run out of targets in effect. So the destruction would be very, very, how to put it, substantial. Most people say complete. Most people think that it would destroy the whole world because it would create a condition of nuclear winter. And I need not go into this because perhaps at a later date we can go into it in more detail, the effects of nuclear weapons, especially as they impinge on the psychology of some of the leaders. That'll be something we'll be very, very interested in. But if we do go into this, it becomes a rather morbid discussion of the prospect of destroying everything. That's an interesting point for us to begin with this idea of bipolarity and the superpowers and all the rest of it. As great powers, as something more than great powers, superpower usually connotes nuclear weapons possession. These powers, they are in a position where they have the weapons that they are not going to be able to use to destroy the other. That is to say, if the other is able to do it to them. So there emerges in the 1960s the problem of the invulnerable deterrent, whether you could do it to the other side, even if the other side surprised you with a nuclear attack, whether you could survive a nuclear attack and still attack him with nuclear weapons. Second strike capability, they usually call that. During the 1960s, that became doctrine. You had to have a second strike capability or you could be denuded of your nuclear weapons by a surprise attack. So the second strike capability, very important thing to both powers. Not everybody in the world who has nuclear weapons today has this second strike capability, this completely invulnerable deterrent. But you want to have a deterrent in order to have this capability that is not just sitting there on the land that can be targetable. So now we're beginning to talk about aircraft carrying rockets, talk about missiles. They at one time thought they were going to move missiles around by rail, or perhaps have hardened silos, hard targets, if you will, that couldn't be attacked by other nuclear weapons. Now I think most nuclear weapons can even attack hard targets. They have the capability for what they call a hard target kill. So it comes down to nuclear submarines, aircraft in the air capable of launching rockets from a very large standoff distance, and those things. That is to say, things that cannot be surprised, cannot be knocked out in a surprise attack. So this second strike capability became the most important thing in nuclear deterrence. So that changes all our conceptions about the idea of the balance of power. Usually when you talk about the balance of power, you're talking about the possibility of making war on somebody, of putting together a coalition against somebody, maybe getting somebody else to fight your war against this person you want to fight, and war is part of the project. And indeed, you can't talk about the balance of power without talking about balance of power wars. But after 1945, when you start to talk about nuclear weapons, can we still use this old vocabulary about the balance of power and about the efficacy of war and all of the rest of that? That's a question. cannot give a very easy answer to that. You certainly cannot give an answer to the affirmative when you ask if war is still an instrument of foreign policy. I think you have to say that deterrence becomes an instrument of foreign policy, but maybe not war. So we build these nuclear weapons then, according to this line of reasoning, we build these nuclear weapons in order to deter the other side from making war. They are peacekeepers. They are angels of peace, as George Bernard Shaw said at one time of the British bombers in the 30s. You know, they were angels of peace. One fears these things so much that one cannot make war under these circumstances. And maybe that's the condition we have. Maybe nuclear weapons have been very lucky for us. There are a number of writers and historians who've made this argument that nuclear weapons are this boon to mankind. It's been just a terrific thing that they've deterred everybody to such a great degree. So we're going to talk about this deterrence problem as we go on as a kind of setting for things. But maybe before I leave this topic, I should make note of the idea that there's a constant feeling through the whole Cold War, we will be paying attention to it, that somehow you can get past this deterrence thing and you can use nuclear weapons. I mean, after all, what's the point of building the things, so the argument runs, if you can't figure out a way to use them one way or another, in some limited way or, to serve some policy, and especially nuclear threats. If you can't use these nuclear weapons that get an advantage over the other guy, then what's the point of building them? At any rate, so that argument runs. So we'll be paying attention to that. And this map that we're talking about retains its importance through our whole course, although we won't be talking mostly about the changes that took place in the world, the historical changes of the Cold War. We'll be talking about them with regard to other places in different maps, much more pertinent maps than this map. But this map still has to be given its due. You have to remember that this fundamental nuclear relationship still obtains. Okay, so there's the problem of the superpowers. And but usually we talk about the great powers, not in terms of this duopoly of the superpowers. We talk about in terms of the multiplicity of powers. And that's another question. Does this idea of the balance of power, does it still retain its relevancy? There's a balance of power that as it existed on the eve of World War I, where you have three central powers there. Germany, Austria, and Turkey. And then you have the Franco-Russian Entente ranged against that. So presumably the British are in this position of balancing the power of Germany by siding with France and Russia. If the British do that, they don't have to land very many troops on the continent. They can mainly blockade the ports of the Germans and deny them access to the seas and to trade and all those other things. And while the land fighting goes on the continent, some continental ally will do most of the fighting and restore the balance for the British. So this balance of power idea is very much a British idea. It came up in the minds of the British, and they're the ones who have worked it out and who still maintain the dogma today with the most enthusiasm that it still has some kind of relevance. So it talks about the problems of what you might call continental great power European politics. The generalizations of the balance of power are dealing with that question. But is that right? Does that exhaust the question? Honor Daumier, the great painter of the 19th century, French painter of the 19th century, gives us this cartoon about the European equilibrium. And there are the Europeans who are maintaining a balance of some kind on the continent, but he says that it has to do with the world. The balance that they maintain on the continent, these European powers, is really a balance of world power. That these European powers are seeking colonies and empires and all the rest of that. It is a scramble for the world, as I like to call it, that goes on in the 19th century. So whoever gains a march in Europe in some war, some balance of power thing, also gains a march against a European rival for that rival's colonies, so that the British pretty much have gained all of their empire by means of the balance of power, by means of the successful outcomes of balance of power wars on the continent over the centuries, mainly in the 17th, 18th, and 19th, and you could even say the 20th century, at least up to 1945. But we're going to see the British power decline very, very quickly, and we will need another explanation to give us an understanding of that. And this, I guess, is the whole point. There's the colonial, there are the colonial possessions of the great powers, and you can see they've gobbled up just about the entire world. And the British, they have control of this considerable stretch in Africa, which should just about provide them with the possibility for a railroad through Africa, which would pretty much dominate Africa. And they also control the Indian Ocean with this great triangle with the Union of South Africa, with India, with Australia. They also have ports on the China coast, and they also have ports, treaty ports on the in the Yangtze Basin in China. So they have considerable investments in China and make a lot of money through all of this control of all this colonial world, all this cheap labor, all these markets for British products, and all these places where the British can get raw materials. So not only the British, but as you see, the French have a gigantic swath of Africa and a number of other colonies, including Indochina in the Far East. And look at this on this map. You don't really don't see anything much of a colonial, how to say, a European colonial presence in South America or Central America. And that's on account of the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, the United States said to the Europeans, hands off, or you can only have what you've already got. And that's a couple of places on the northern coast of the Spanish Main, and I should say on the northern Spanish Main coast, and a few islands in the Caribbean, but no further than that, said President Monroe. And especially we don't want the British sneaking down along the Pacific coast and enlarging Canada at the expense of the United States. That's another thing that Monroe specified when he laid down his famous doctrine in 1823. So on account of the Monroe Doctrine, the scramble for the world has not really affected, well, has only, I should say, indirectly affected Latin America. And so at any rate, Latin America doesn't get gobbled up and transformed into British colonies. We're going to see all this transformed in the course of this. All these empires are going to disappear, and most of them violently. So we have to trace that as a revolutionary aspect of this course, and really it should in many ways take center stage. If we're looking at this course geopolitically, not just in terms of the strategic balance between the nuclear powers, but if we're looking at it in terms of the actual geopolitical holdings, all of the strategic points on the globe, we'd have to say that this course is a history of the decline of the European colonial powers. And so we'd have to say, how does the Cold War relate to the decline of the European colonial powers, which we will be tracing in our narrative? And the greatest empire, as I've already indicated, the British. You can already see what they have in Africa. In fact, this map doesn't do them justice. At their height, I think, in the 20s, you could say that the British probably are the greatest empire, in fact, by far, the greatest empire of all the European empires. We generalize about them, but we shouldn't forget the others. Just the British alone impress us enormously. But there are other colonial empires, and they pretty much have control of Egypt in an informal, at least in an informal way at this time. And so this map really doesn't even do the British justice. We're going to see all of that, most of that, disappear. So how do the British think about this whole problem of the balance of power in Europe and the whole problem of the scramble for the world? In 1904, Sir Halford Mackinder produced a map something like this, in which he described all of the history of the world. Or at any rate, he tried to describe it all in a few sentences. He said, there's a heartland right in the middle of Eurasia. It's an area of enormous grasslands. They use the word steppe. The Russians like to use this word steppe, grasslands, prairies, for this enormous stretch in central Eurasia. Who controls the heartland controls the world island. Who controls the world island controls the world, said Mackinder. So there's the idea of the geopolitics. Nearly all the geopolitics in the world that is professed by people who claim to know all about that sort of thing. Russians are the most interested in it right now. They go back to Mackinder and they go back to this idea of the heartland, and they go from there. So one of the important aspects of this, in fact, maybe the most important aspect of this is really a description of a British conceptualization of world politics. It all revolves around the heartland, because that inner crescent we're talking about there, that's where the British Empire is. So the British Empire is in a circle of containment, if I can use that term. That's a Cold War term. Containment of the heartland power. The heartland power would be Russia, although Mackinder said in 1919 it would have been Russia plus some other big power. That would have been enough to completely dominate the world. So he was thinking about Russia and Germany. People who talk about it today, they talk about Russia and China. So what they're saying is if Russia and China are together, can naval powers, and here they're talking about the United States first and foremost, but also there's Britain in there if you want to look at it historically, the Anglo-Americans if you want to just kind of join together those two ways of conceiving it. Can these naval powers prevail against the land power of the heartland? This is a very British way of looking at this sort of thing. But I think it's most interesting to consider what this actually translates to. Now remember, he brought forward the idea of geopolitics around this idea of the heartland in 1904. What was he thinking of? He was thinking about Russia. So he's thinking that the Russian Empire, as it impinges on Constantinople, on India, through the Hindu Kush, on the Far East and the British possessions there, as it expands. It represents a threat to the British Empire. So the idea of containment is part of this British notion of containing Russian power. But the British also have to worry about the United States of America, a budding land power of enormous proportions, and certainly a naval power. Anytime the United States puts its mind to creating a navy, it could be the greatest navy in the world. This is 1904, when Mackinder offered these ideas. So, can the naval powers impinge on the heartland power? It applies to Anglo-Russian relations, but also applies to Anglo-American relations as well. So the British don't have an interest in seeing Russia expand. That is to say, they'd like to see Russia balanced. And similarly, they would probably like to see the United States balanced. It would have been a good thing for this conception of things if the United States had lost the Civil War. The North had lost the Civil War. The United States broken up into 4 or 5 states. The British could promote a balance of power in North America. Who knows, open up Latin America. It might be a good thing. And perhaps you could put it more strongly. If the British don't do this, they don't properly balance these two budding superpowers, Russia and the United States, that the British Empire is doomed. So think of that as a large historical generalization, painting with a broad brush, to be sure, with history. But that's a general picture of the way the British conceived of the world, I think, in the 20th century. At any rate, those who thought in terms of geopolitics. All right. None of that applies immediately at the end of World War II, obviously. You can see there's not going to be any balance of European power. Here's a map that shows where the Russians are at the end of the war. On the right of the map, you can see they've more or less defeated the Nazis everywhere in East Central Europe. And they're going to be able to have those colonies excuse me, those states friendly to them in the future. And German power doesn't seem to be worth much. So the whole German threat, 2 world wars over that, it's not going to be. And it isn't even there today. There really is no German world power today. And the French, I don't know if they're going to get to say much if the Europeans control half of the continent. If the Russians control half of the European continent as they are in this picture. So and it's hard to see the British doing anything much about Russian power. So you might even say that this rise of Russia to the point of such power after the defeat of the Nazis puts the Europeans in a position where, well, we're really post-Europe. When it comes to the balance of power, you can't talk about European great powers anymore. It becomes a joke in 1945. So if you can't talk about great powers in Europe and balance of power wars in Europe, I guess you can't talk about European colonies anymore either. So that's what it seems to portend. A brand new era, transfiguration of all of the existing ideas, throw them all out, and think of everything anew. So that's the geopolitical picture, and it portends the decline of the powers as you see on this map. And this map even shows Russia as an imperial power even after the Russian Revolution. I don't agree with that, and I'll indicate that as we go through this course. I don't see Russia as an ordinary colonial power. Russia is a revolutionary and communist state, just as the Cold Warriors say, and as the Russians maintain throughout the period. We're going to be talking about genuine revolution. And that, of course, raises the question, is there something else besides geopolitics that we need to take into consideration when we look at the background of the Cold War? Well, of course we do. We need to take into consideration communism. Where does communism come from? What on earth is that? Is that just a response to the industrialization of Europe in the 19th century? Communism is a response to the Industrial Revolution. Is that what we're talking about? Yes, certainly. Communism is an idea that says that the industrial proletariat, if it organizes and if it gains democracy, ought to be able to vote out the employers in their bourgeois parties and ought to have some kind of a socialist system over a long period of time by who knows what process. I'm talking about something that could take a century or a century and a half. Who knows? And it will take place in terms of violent cataclysms. So it's not the kind of easy thing to predict. The idea is associated with Karl Marx. So if you think about Marxism and communism in that way, and that certainly is a perfectly relevant a way to do it, the way that most people do it today, that is certainly helpful to get us an idea of what communism is. But if we also want to understand what it is, it's something that came up in the course of the French Revolution. It is a part of the process of the universalization, I think I would have to say, of the French Revolution. All those ideas that came forward in the French Revolution, really they appear in the European Enlightenment, and they appear as much in the United States almost I say, in the United States, as they do in Europe. The United States is more conservative in the sense that it's a country that relies on slavery and has a constitution that relies on protection of the slave owners. So it's always going to be of a different order from the Europeans, but nevertheless, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, they represent the same sort of ideas that we associate with being modern today. So that means, constitution, democracy, universal suffrage, not just manhood suffrage, but everybody, universal suffrage, and all those ideas that I find so attractive, like free press and everything that's associated with that, free trade unions, public schools, graduated income tax, I would add, and all of those things that we consider attractive and progressive and et cetera, that all these ideas are the ideas in which the Russian Revolution came forward. And that Russian revolutionaries are schooled mentally in this tradition of the French Revolution. And this is indicated in a Delacroix painting from the Revolution of 1830. Now, the French Revolution is over by this time, but it's another recrudescence of the ideas of the French Revolution in 1830. And we're going to see more of those, and indeed the Russian Revolution of 1917 and communism in the 20th century are a further recrudescence of these ideas of the French Revolution. But at the same time, the Europeans, while all this revolutionary activity is going on throughout the world, and in Europe, right in the heart of Europe in the 19th century, they are busy trying to carve up the entire world, scrambling for the world. And my favorite phrase for that, European powers looking for ways to advance their empires and thinking about the revolution, of course, in the back of their mind, but just hoping that it's just a nightmare that one day somehow will go away. But it's not going to go away, especially if these powers that we're talking about, especially if they get into wars with one another and start conscripting armies of ordinary people to go fight, put arms in their hands, they're going to end up with some kind of revolutionary problem if these wars don't go just the way they plan. And of course, when it comes to things like that, they have no idea what they're doing. A lot of these wars, and especially World War I, very definitely stumbled into in the course of this ecstatic scramble for the world, trying to seize every place on Earth. It could have broken out almost anywhere if it didn't break out in the Balkans. So at any rate, this horrific scramble for the world ends up in this ghastly war, World War I. I mean, practically nothing good, I think, can be said about World War I. By the way, I would object to anybody who tries to say something good about World War I. Maybe there are a few things that can be said, as with all wars. They have to be said with an enormous amount of sang-froid. You have to say, if it weren't for World War I, the Russian Revolution wouldn't have happened, and colonialism wouldn't eventually disappear. So that requires a very long-range judgment. Not the kind of thing you could say to a soldier going off to the front in World War I. Not very much that was good that could have been said to that generation, except that they could overthrow their governments if this war didn't go right. And that is what happened. That is how World War I ended, with revolutions all over Europe, not just in Russia. Although Russia's the most important one, because it was the first really big one. The Irish Revolution, of course, predates the Russian Revolution and in a way spurs it on, starting in 1916. But the revolution in Russia is mainly a mutiny, and it's a mutiny in the name of a couple of ideas. The idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which has undergone a certain transformation in the hands of the Russians. According to the ideas of the French Revolution, according to Jacobinism, it's a revolution of the workers, but also the peasants. That's a French revolutionary idea rather than a strictly Marxist idea. Marx didn't think much of the peasants. So the worker in this cartoon, who has the capital under his boot, has got a banner that says, "All hail to the workers and peasants' Soviet power." So that's the Russian Revolution. And the way the Russian Revolution depicts the enemy it's up against in Russia, there's a capitalist with a top hat who's crushing the worker underfoot. He holds up a banner that says, "All power to the capitalists, death to the workers and the peasants." So that's pretty straightforward. But as you see, it isn't just capital versus labor, just a Marxist conception here. It's also a Jacobin conception that the peasants are included, that it's the broad democracy, the workers and the peasants, against backwardness, the old regime, and capital. That's the basis of communism, because it breaks out in Russia rather than in Germany. If it had broken out in Germany first or England first, this peasant quality, this peasant aspect, and this Jacobinism, I should also say, probably one would not appear in the same way. Well, are we going backwards? Yes, so the Russian Revolution gives a message onto the world, international message. Make revolution like ours, as we have done. Have a communist revolution in which the workers establish a socialist dictatorship of the proletariat. So it says that to the European great powers and to the United States. But it also says to the rest of the world that it wants to overthrow imperialism. Well, Marx didn't say that in the 19th century. Marx didn't issue a call for India to be independent of the British. He figured it would happen at some point, but through an evolution. But he didn't advocate the overthrow by Indian nationalists of the British Empire and the rest of the empire. But now the Russian Revolution under Lenin and Trotsky, they say, as this poster indicates, death to world imperialism. And there's world imperialism, a serpent that is wrapped around the industrial capacity, the capacity for creating the stuff of life and squeezing the life out of it. And that the workers and peasants, sailors, everybody else, soldiers of the world, they have to combine together to kill this serpent of world imperialism, death to world imperialism. So what does that mean? It means the Russian communists now advocate the overthrow of the British Empire in India and everywhere else, of course. And what goes with that, the overthrow of every other imperial power in the world, and the enmity, you have to say, of all of the imperial powers in the world. And more than that, once the revolution happened, Russia was part of an alliance with Britain, France, and the United States by that time. By 1918, they're all allied, or at any rate, they're working together against Germany. And they all, in order to keep the war going, to restore the Russian front, after the communists took Russia out of the war. And remember, that's the whole thing with Bolshevism. It begins with a mutiny against the imperialist war. That's the way they put it. By the way, I think this is perfectly right. Nothing wrong with this historically as a generalization. And here are the imperial powers, the Entente powers, Britain, France, the United States, and anybody else they can find to recruit, because they're not going to win this with their own troops. They have to use other people's troops. The troops of 14 nations intervening in Russia during the Russian Civil War, which ranges from 1918 to 1921. So this Russian Civil War will also be participated in by the United States. Not in a very big way, kind of a pathetic way, you have to say. We landed a couple thousand troops up in the north, as you can see on this map, at Murmansk. And we landed a few thousand troops in the Far East to keep an eye mainly on the Japanese. The British encouraged the Japanese for that very reason. They knew they could not land British troops in Russia, and they knew that this thing would really only work properly if the Americans got into it in a big way. After all, the Americans had probably 7 million men under arms at this time. They hadn't fought much on the Western Front. Everybody else was exhausted, including the British. I mean, all they could do was try to stoke this thing up and try and supervise it in some way. If it was going to be won, it would have to be won maybe by the Japanese to take everything up to Lake Baikal, as you see in Asia here, under these hetmen Semyonov, for example, and Kalmykov in the Far East, these Cossacks, and the United States. So the United States could have intervened in this thing in a big way, and probably, and I've always thought, probably could have won the thing, if the United States had an interest in it. But what is the United States' interest in conquering Russia? Come on. Come on. There is no interest. It makes no sense. In fact, this whole intervention does not really make sense. The British and the French plunged into it thinking maybe Russia was going to fall apart completely and maybe they'd have an opportunity to annex territories in the south. You can see the French armies are in the southern Ukraine. So they get mining, metallurgy, and other pre-war interests. The French were the biggest investors in Russia prior to the war, so the French would get that. Maybe turn southern Ukraine into some kind of colony, protectorate of some sort. British get the territories in the Caucasus, where the oil is, Central Asia, where the oil is. That's what they're mainly interested in. So this could have turned out to be a general partition of Russia, had these white generals managed to overthrow the Bolsheviks, because they probably couldn't have run Russia by themselves. At any rate, not if they had to do it with the aid of all these foreign troops. So there you have the picture of the Allied intervention, something the Russians remember. And they like to think that the United States was the big mover. And certainly they did during the Cold War. Khrushchev in the 50s made it out that the United States organized the Allied intervention against the Russian Revolution. Wrong. The United States did not organize the thing. The United States was pulled in, played a very reluctant and confused role, not to say ill-advised role in the whole thing. And in the end, it was certainly not in the United States' interest to try and defeat Bolshevism by force at the end of World War I. But it does raise the question that whether at the end of the war, ideologically, there weren't two alternatives before the world's people, ideologically. So this is going to be interesting for us, talking about the Cold War. It's kind of a precursor of the idea of the Cold War. Wilson emerges here, Woodrow Wilson. He emerges here as the proponent of the idea of democracy throughout the world. Win the war for democracy. And he says that everybody in the world, including the colonial countries, they all ought to be able to determine their own fate, self-determination. A very pregnant phrase, self-determination. Wilson and Lenin, of course, stands for anti-imperialism, communism, workers and peasants, Soviets, that kind of thing. Any revolutionary who's anti-imperialist, he's for. Wilson is sort of anti-imperialist too, but not in the same way as the communists. It's a little confused. And the position of the Americans, of course, is rather confused. And not everybody's behind Wilson, bear in mind. So the Americans are not exactly the class enemy. Well, that's not a good way to put it. They're not exactly the voice of world imperialism at the end of World War I, with Lenin on the other side. They're really rivals for an anti-imperialist ideological development. That's an interesting thing. Arno Meyer's big fat book on this, which has the title Wilson versus Lenin, lays this argument out at some length, and I think it's very, very important to get hold of it. But is this right? Is this right? My generation certainly didn't think so. All the people my age who went into teaching, especially American history, went into the teaching of the Cold War, they made out something rather different. They said the U.S. was the enemy right from the beginning. That the Cold War begins with the Russian Revolution, begins at the end of World War I, and that the United States is allied with imperialist forces against the Russian Revolution, basically right from the beginning. And it's a much more simple story than people like me, for example, would indicate. So the main progenitor of these ideas taught at University of Wisconsin many years, William Appleman Williams. This is one of his very powerful, influential books. Many of his students wrote similarly influential books. They argued for an interpretation of the Cold War in terms of the fundamental innocence of communism and the fundamental guilt of U.S. imperialism, and not just from 1945, but right from the beginning in 1917. Is that right? Are they right? Well, you know, I don't think they are quite right, although they certainly maybe have corrected some more innocent ideas about how the Americans were surprised by it when Stalin sprung the Cold War on. That's the way they tried to make the argument through most of my life. Maybe what they argued, the revisionist historians of Williams' students, maybe it's an improvement on the earlier version of the thing, which makes the United States totally innocent and the Soviet Union a version of Nazism, basically. I mean, that will be what you will hear from many Cold Warriors even today. Maybe this is not right, though. Maybe Williams is not right either. So here's the picture in the 30s. And this is the way things went with imperialism and anti-imperialism, in my opinion. Here you have the fascist powers, Japan with a considerable influence in China, and the ability to absorb French Indochina easily, with no difficulty. The French practically gave up in the 30s, gave up the idea that they would be able to resist the Japanese in Indochina. They had to depend on the British. And the British had interests in the Far East, so if the British could finagle away, maybe through their influence over the United States, maybe the French could be saved. That is to say, their colonies could be saved in the Far East. And with them, you have the Dutch in Indonesia, and you have the Portuguese with some colonies there, too. You know. So that's the fundamental problem of imperialism in the era of the rise of the fascist powers. And the imperialists centered on the idea of Prince Kanoye of the Japanese, which was taken up by Neville Chamberlain, that the fascists were really have-not imperialists. Oh, think of that. Have-not imperialists. In other words, they were the poor relations of the imperialist powers, and all they wanted was to have a few colonies comparable to what the imperialist powers had. So if Britain and France and Holland, the other imperialists, would simply say to the fascist powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, well, you can have a certain part of the world, and when we grab things from this point on, every time we grab things, let's have a conference to discuss who gets what, and we can all get along if only this mood of reconciliation is created among the imperialists. That was the fundamental idea of British appeasement. Not cowardice, although it doesn't need, interpreting to explain that people don't want to have another war. So, I mean, appeasement does mean that. So they've got that argument going for them in spades. And indeed, most of the left was with them most of the way on this question. But the fundamental thing is to come to terms with these fascist powers all over the world. The British thought you could do it in three different ways. They didn't see them as all one threat. That's where they differ with the United States. Roosevelt saw the fascist powers as one threat. And they weren't just going to be a threat to the world island or even to Africa, but they're going to be a threat in Latin America too. Threat to the United States. An existential threat that had to be opposed. So that's a big difference between the British and the United States. When various struggles came up in Europe, the Spanish Civil War, for example, genuine, popular struggle against, on behalf of a legitimate government against a fascist rebellion, aided by Hitler and Mussolini, really to the point where it could not have won. Franco could not have won in Spain without Hitler and Mussolini helping him out. This vast popular rebellion, which was aided by intellectuals who we admire, and some who've had an influence on the Cold War, including George Orwell here pictured, who was a Trotskyist or semi-Trotskyist, I guess you might say, member of the PUM, the Partido Obrero Unificación Marxista, a left-wing party in Spain, here inspecting a rifle. He's getting ready to go to the front and fight the fascists. So when this Spanish Civil War occurred, the European powers took the view, tut-tut, We deplore the methods used by fascism. I don't know. Can't you find a different way to express your interests? Can't we have a conference? Can't we have a discussion? Armed non-intervention. So non-intervention was the policy of the powers. And here Lowe, the British cartoonist, who's a critic of the appeasers, here he sees them strangling Spain. And there's Franco with Mussolini helping. And there other British saying, tut-tut, we deplore your methods, and et cetera, et cetera. But of course doing nothing about it. And in a certain sense, aiding and abetting the fascists. And their real intention, as this Russian cartoon seems to indicate, the real intention of the fascists, I mean of the appeasers, is to aim the fascists in another direction. They want to steer the fascists away from West Europe. So the sign they're holding up says West Europe. They say, so the British and French gendarmes, they're directing traffic, are telling the fascists, don't go to West Europe. Go to the Soviet Union. Attack the Soviet Union. That's what appeasement really is. It means no war in Western Europe, but if you want to have a war with the Soviet Union, we'll hold your coat. And that's what the Russians essentially say about it. I don't really disagree with that. I think in general that's pretty much what they have in mind, and it's their imperial interests that drive them to this. After all, the only way really to defend the British Empire is to make a deal with the fascists, as they constantly warn, and the most intelligent British historians say this, if we British get into a war, another world war to fight fascism, the only people who are going to profit from this are going to be the Yankees and the Bolsheviks. It'll be the end of the European powers. They're not wrong there. That's not wrong. But this is the way Roosevelt sees it. They're all in the same boat. They're all playing the same game ideologically. And then Roosevelt is not blind to seeing things ideologically. That's one of his great, great strengths. He's also a great, great tactician, diplomatist, etc. In terms of the balance of power. But he also sees the world ideologically and spiritually, you might say. This is what the U.S. says we're really up against, this bunch of gangsters throughout the whole world. We're going to organize solidarity one with another and represent a united threat. They have to be taken on, all of them. You can't deal with it singly. The British take the view, you can make a deal with Japan and divide China. Why not? You can make a deal with Italy and give them Ethiopia, give them expansion of their sphere of influence in Africa. Maybe they didn't get enough of Africa when we scrambled for Africa in the 19th century. With Germany, give them more of East Central Europe. We are not passionate about East Central Europe. Give them that. And if they end up fighting the Soviet Union, well, that's not the worst thing in the world. Certainly not for the British Empire. Strictly speaking, for the British Empire, the worst thing in the world is the Soviet Union and communism. After all, that's the most embittered ideological enemy of the British Empire. So why shouldn't they come to terms with the fascists against that? So these are realistic things that imperialists have to think of. If they lead their great power, lead their countries as great powers, and especially that means as imperial powers, as world powers. But Roosevelt doesn't think of it that way. He thinks the fascists represent a threat to democracy, have to be taken on in an ideological way. I think he's perfectly right. And here's how he sizes up the pluses and minuses of the thing, the nuts and bolts of the thing. This is a map that gives an indication, in a very general way, of course, of the productive capacity of the big agents that we're talking about here in the 30s. So you see the United States is the biggest industrial power with all sorts of industrial potential, a lovely isolated position, potentially the biggest naval power. And there's Britain, very, very powerful, and France pretty powerful too, and then China and Russia. So if they can all cooperate, they certainly could beat back these three fascist powers. Imagine this picture if you took the United States out of the equation, though. Could China and Russia take on the imperial powers with the assistance of Britain and France, especially if the British and French didn't assist them? Gee. So what the United States is facing there is that there's a coalition to be made to balance the whole world, not just Europe. So this is the biggest balance of power enterprise, you could say, of them all, the struggle against fascism. But we don't have to put it that way. We can put it in terms of the crude realism of the balance of power, or we can put it in terms of the ideological, spiritual quality of a democratic struggle against these fascists who do represent the cancellation of every hopeful progressive idea that came out of the American and French revolutions. So we can put it either way, ideologically or geopolitically. But anyhow, Roosevelt says when you size it up this way, the United States is needed, and with this coalition we can do the job. But the United States is not going to leap into the thing and do it by itself, elbow others aside and take on the fascists by itself. No. It's going to support the ones who are doing the most damage to the fascists. When the United States get into the war, Britain and France were just about beaten. So it's China and Russia. And so the United States policy has to be with China and Russia against the fascist powers, whether the British and the French like it or not. That has to be the United States position on the matter. And as with the balance of power, the one who is balancing does not lose too many. So it's not so easy to find, but the American losses in there are around 300,000 in World War II. Whereas with the Russians and the Chinese, we've got losses in the order of 20 million or so. 20 million or more. We're not sure about all these figures. But at any rate, they are the ones who fought the war, took the losses, won the war. Not the Chinese so much, but although the Chinese played their role, but the Soviets, the Russians, they're the ones who won World War II. What were the stakes? Here's how the geopolitician Nicholas Spickman saw it in his book America in World Politics, which was published in 1942, right in the middle of the war. He said, if we lose this war and the Nazis control Russia, they will have, in effect, after having defeated Britain and France, which will be child's play for them, if they can manage to defeat Russia, that's a big if. But if they do that, they're in a position then to encircle the new world. The old world will encircle the new world. It's an encirclement idea. It's a geopolitical idea in the event of a Nazi victory in World War II. On the other hand, if the Americans and the British and the Free French and the Chinese and the Russians, of course, maybe I should put it the other way, if the Russians, together with their American friends and their other allies, can prevail in this thing, what will result at the end of it is the naval encirclement of the world island. This looks a little like Mackinder's picture from 1904. Britain, or I should say the United States, now becomes the inheritor of the balance of power, or the geopolitical situation, I should say, conceptualized by the British at the turn of the 20th century. A very interesting idea. Now, that's what the war means from the standpoint of geopolitics. So once again, it's the heartland, the main pivot area on the world island, the control of the rim lands, the naval power, this is the U.S., up against the land power of the Soviet Union. That's be a way of conceiving of it ideologically. Here's how the brilliant caricaturist Arthur Sheik, the Pole, how he imagined it. And that's the way things were in 1940, when the United States was not in the war. and maybe was going to go along with the defeat of France and with the hegemony of the fascist powers, and that's the world they would have. And there's the Jewish community of the world lying there as a bare rug under the feet of Hitler. That's the world that was being contemplated in 1940, and looked very likely. And basically, that's a world in which the Nazis would have run everything. So this is another way, caricature way, to be sure, of seeing the ideological side of what we've just been talking about, the geopolitics. I don't think either one of these ways of seeing it is particularly, exclusively right vis-a-vis the other. No, both perfectly good ways of looking at the actual stakes of World War II. And, of course, what he argued, as everybody else did, as every wholesome progressive person argued, was that everybody had to pull together in this fight to cooperate across various barriers, race barriers in the United States, class barriers even, to fight against the fascists. So here he says, black, white, and Jew in the United States, they all have to pull together against the fascists, build those tanks, defeat the fascists. And together, we shall strangle the fascists, as this poster has it, with British and the Soviets. And look at that Soviet flag as they're wrapped around Hitler's neck. And the result of it all, of course, will be the liberation of the entire world from European imperialism. Did the British think of it that way? Did everybody think of it that way? It's not so sure. It's not so sure. And in fact, at the end of the war, we sort of have to ask the question, what are the imperialists going to do now that the Soviet Union has pretty much done all the job of defeating Nazi Germany, together, of course, with its gallant allies? And the idea of communism has defended itself in such a brilliant way with its tremendous anti-imperial perspectives. What are we imperialists going to do to save the British Empire? That's the question before the British. Every British statesman, including the Labourites, they have to think of this too. How are we going to save the British Empire? Well, if the United States and the Soviets stay together, as in the wartime coalition, maybe this is not possible. Maybe they are going to impose the destruction of the empires, the decolonization, impose that on us. Maybe the only thing we have going for us is enmity between the United States and the Soviets to reinforce the idea of the encirclement of the world island by the rim lands, which happen to be our colonies. Maybe we need the Cold War. That's the question before us. I'm not going to give an answer to this question. I ask you to ponder it. I do that frequently in this course. I'll be asking you to come up with some thought, to contend with some question. And it's bad, I couldn't dictate. I mean, if I could put a PowerPoint slide on here with 4 or 5 points that you have to memorize this and feed it back to me on an exam. That's not the way we do things here. It's not high school. I mean, I'm not a teacher. I'm a professor. This is a college course. I have to put these questions to you, intelligent people. Bear in mind, you're the most intelligent people we have in the United States. Even our modest institution is closed to 70 or 80% of the people of your class and your generation. Bear that in mind. You're the elite in a certain way. We're all something of an elite. We're all something of an elite. A little bit of an elite. So these are the questions we have to ponder about history. And I'm interested to know what you're going to think. Do the European imperialists at the end of World War II, do they need the Cold War? Is the Cold War the only thing that will allow them to continue to defend imperialism. All right, so that's a thought that I'm going to leave you with. Next thing I'll take up is the actual origins of the Cold War, how it happened in Europe. But I'll also take up all these questions we brought up so far, the perspective for Mideast oil, for the independence of India, and for other burning questions at the end of World War II, and also for the revolutionary quality of Soviet communism. We can't lose sight of that. This revolutionism, trying to overthrow everything in the world. That's what we'll start to talk about next time.